I swear I was cursed from my first breath, maybe even before. The moment I was born, I was a mess of clenched eyes and bloody wails under the harsh hospital lights. I had taken the most precious thing from my mother. She, a vibrant soul, slipped from this world just minutes after I arrived, as if we were two spirits who had missed our celestial connection, destined never to coexist. My father followed a few years later. I was too young to understand the finality of loss, but I have flashbacks of that day. The screech of tires, the shriek of metal, the scratch of firefighter's jacket on my cheek as I was pulled from the wreckage, tears carving paths through the grime on my face. They called my survival a miracle. But even then, innocent and fragile as I was, a part of me knew the truth. Death had brushed past me, taken what it was owed, and decided to let me go. But there would be a price. From that moment on, loss became a second skin, a shadow I couldn't shake. The funerals, the pitying looks, the twice-tight hugs from distant relatives. My grandparents took me in, did their best to build a home, to shield me from the darkness that clung to me. But fate wasn't satisfied with the toll I'd already paid. My grandfather went first. One sunny morning, he was at the breakfast table, sipping coffee and complaining about Roger's terrible pitching rotation. Then came the gasp, the shudder, the fall. He was gone before the paramedics even arrived. My grandmother tried to fill the void, but not even her stubborn spirit could fight off the slow, merciless creep of cancer. By 16, I was on intimate terms with the funeral home. The cloying scent of flowers, the hollow condolences, the ill-fitting shoulders of the suit. Loss was my only constant. I clawed my way through high school and college with a grim determination, my ambitions always shaded by the knowledge that nothing lasts. When I graduated, I was broke, homeless, and desperate. Maybe it was that desperation that drew me to the funeral trade. A morbid fascination with the one thing that had defined my life. Or perhaps it was some twisted idea that I could finally control the force that had taken everything from me. Whatever the reason, I found myself standing before Andrew's son's funeral home. The old Victorian mansion was a nightmare of peeling paint, loose shingles, and windows that stared coldly out onto a weed-choked yard. The whole building seemed to lean forward slightly, a dare to the world, an invitation to see the horrors it held. I should have turned around right then. I should have listened to the fear that was a constant hum in my heart. But desperation is a powerful motivator. I pushed open the rusted iron gate, my heart hammering like a war drum, and approached the front door. Before my knuckles could even make contact, it creaked open as if on a breath of its own. Harlan Andrews stood in the doorway. He was a tall, gaunt man, his face a roadmap of wrinkles and age spots, his eyes sunken but sharp. His suit was well-tailored, but carried the musty air of a bygone century. When he smiled, I saw yellowed teeth and gums that had receded with age. "You must be my new apprentice," he said, his voice as dry as old parchment. Come in, come in. We have much to discuss." I should have run. I should have turned and fled back into the sun-drenched street. But there was something in his gaze that held me fast, a mixture of terror and curiosity. I followed him inside, and my heart skipped a beat as the heavy door thudded shut behind me. The interior was just as unsettling as the exterior, all dark wood and dusty velvet, the air thick with the smell of decay and secrets. Harlan led me down a series of dark, winding corridors, the floorboards groaning under our feet, until we reached a small, cluttered office. He motioned for me to sit, then slowly lowered himself into the chair behind his desk, his joints popping audibly. "I'll be blunt," he said, steepling his fingers, his expression grave. "I'm an old man. I need someone to take over the business. The pay is good, and there's a room for you upstairs. All you have to do is learn the trade and do as I say." He looked up, his eyes piercing. "Do you think you can handle that?" I hesitated, a thousand thoughts racing through my mind, but in the end, desperation won out over my unease. "Yes," I said, my voice so quiet I barely recognized it. "I can handle it." Harlan's smile stretched across his face, and for a fleeting moment, I saw a flicker of something ancient and hungry in the depths of his eyes. "Excellent," he said, extending a hand to shake. His skin was cold and papery, but his grip was surprisingly firm. "Welcome to the family business, boy." A chill shot up my spine at his words. This was an omen, a sign of the horrors to come. But there was no turning back now. I had made my deal with the devil, and this house had claimed me. Harlan led me upstairs, the narrow, winding staircase groaning under our weight. He pushed open a door, and a wave of musty air, a mix of camphor and old paper, washed over me. The room was small, with a sloped ceiling and a window overlooking the overgrown backyard. The furniture was antique, relics of a faded grandeur. A four-poster bed draped in faded brocade, a massive oak wardrobe that dominated one corner, and a writing desk cluttered with yellowed papers and tarnished brass trinkets. "This was your great-great-grandfather's room," Harlan said, his fingers brushing dust from the mantelpiece. "He started this place when embalming was still a new art. You'll be carrying on a long and proud tradition." I dropped my tattered suitcase on the bed, trying to ignore the creeping sense of unease. There was something wrong with this place, something more than just age and neglect. It felt as if the very walls were watching me, sizing me up, judging whether I was worthy to join their ranks. "Get some rest," Harlan said, moving toward the door. "We start at 4 a.m. sharp. Trust me, you're going to need your strength for what's coming." He left me with that cryptic warning, the door clicking shut behind him. I stood there for a long time, staring at my new room, trying to shake off the dreamlike sense of dread. But sleep didn't come easy that night. I stared up at the canopy of the four-poster bed, listening to the house breathe around me. Every creak of the floorboards, every rattle of a window pane in the wind sent a jolt of anxiety through me. It was as if the very bones of the house were whispering to me, hinting at the secrets they held. When I finally did drift off, my sleep was filled with images of decaying corpses, grinning skeletons, and cold, grasping hands trying to pull me down into some unspeakable abyss. I woke with a start, my heart pounding, my sheets soaked with sweat. It wasn't the dream that had woken me, but a knock at the door. Harlan was rapping on the wood with his bony knuckles. "Time to rise and shine, my boy," he called, his voice unnaturally cheerful for such an ungodly hour. The dead wait for no man. I dragged my exhausted body to the door. Harlan was waiting, fully dressed despite the pre-dawn hour, a manic gleam in his eyes that made me take an involuntary step back. "Before we begin," he said, pressing a folded piece of paper into my hand, "you need to learn the rules of the house. Read them. Your survival might depend on it." With that, he turned and descended the stairs, leaving me to stare after him in confusion. My hands trembled as I unfolded the paper. My eyes struggled to make out the spidery, cramped handwriting, a script that looked almost frantic, filled with a sense of urgency. The rules were as follows. Rule 1. Get their eyes closed and keep them closed. Forget this, and you won't sleep for a week. Neither will they. Rule 2. The coolers must be kept locked at all times. This is not a suggestion. Rule 3. Respect the final wishes of every client. You don't have to like them, but you must obey them. Rule 4. Keep to the schedule. Monday, for a.m. to 5 p.m. Tuesday, Friday, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. Saturdays are yours. Sundays are for them. Never be in the prep room after sunset. Rule 5. Visitors are allowed, but they must know the rules. No exceptions. Rule 6. Absolutely no entering the hallway between 11 p.m. and 1:31 a.m. You won't like what finds you if you're caught. Rule 7. The power will cut out at exactly 3:36 a.m. and return at 3:42 a.m. Do not, under any circumstances, try to find out why. Rule 8. Never investigate the sound of crying. No matter how close, no matter how real. Don't look. Rule 9. If someone knocks on the door outside of business hours, do not answer it. Not for family, not for friends, not for the mailman. Do not open the door. I read the list over and over, my mind struggling to process the bizarre set of instructions. Some of it sounded like common sense. Of course, I'd keep potentially hazardous things locked up, and of course, I'd respect a person's last wishes. But what was in the hallway at night that I had to avoid? Why would the power go out at such a precise time? And what kind of knocking was I supposed to ignore? A part of me wanted to confront Harlan, to demand an explanation for these cryptic prohibitions. But a deeper, more primal instinct held me back. There were forces at work here, things far beyond my comprehension, things that could not be reasoned with or defied. I carefully folded the paper, tucked it into my pocket, and went downstairs to start my first day. Harlan was waiting at the bottom of the stairs, a knowing smile playing on his thin lips. "Ready to meet our guest?" he asked, a strange eagerness in his voice. I swallowed, my mouth suddenly dry. "I'm ready," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. He let out a dry, rasping laugh that sounded like gravel in his throat, a sound that sent a chill down my neck. "That's the spirit, my boy. Follow me." He led me down a narrow corridor, the floorboards groaning beneath our feet. The walls were lined with faded photographs of stern-faced men and women in old-fashioned attire. At the end of the hall was a heavy wooden door, its surface scarred and mottled with age. Harlan produced a rusted key from his pocket, inserted it into the lock, and with a metallic shriek, the door swung open. "Welcome," he said, a dark light gleaming in his eyes, "to the heart of our operation." The room beyond was vast and cold, the air thick with the sharp scent of chemicals and the cloying sweetness of decay. A row of stainless steel tables stood in neat lines, gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. Along one wall, a bank of industrial-sized coolers hummed softly, their doors secured with heavy padlocks. Harlan walked over to one of the tables and slapped his gnarled hand on its surface. "This is where the magic happens," he said, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "Where we take the remnants of a life and transform them into a final, dignified farewell." He beckoned me toward one of the coolers, produced another key, and with a practiced twist, undid the lock. A blast of cold air hit me, and I shivered. He pulled out a drawer. Inside lay the body of a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair. His face was waxy and pale, his eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. "Meet Mr. Wallace," Harlan said with a strange sort of tenderness. "Heart attack. The family wants an open casket, so we have to make him presentable." I stared at the body, my stomach churning. I'd known intellectually what this job entailed, but confronting the cold, stiff reality of a corpse, the utter finality of it, was something else entirely. Harlan must have sensed my discomfort, because he clapped a hand on my shoulder, his fingers digging into my skin. "You'll get used to it," he whispered, his breath unnervingly warm against my ear. "You'll learn to see them as a canvas, a blank slate for you to practice your art." He walked me through the process, step by step, the washing, the injection of the embalming fluid, the careful setting of the limbs and features. He moved with a precision and reverence that was almost liturgical. It was clear he took a deep, strange pride in his work. As we worked on Mr. Wallace, I found myself slipping into a kind of trance, my mind detaching from the cold, grim reality of the task. It was easier to think of the body as an object, a puzzle to be solved, than as a man who had once lived and breathed and loved. But that illusion would occasionally shatter. I'd glance over at a photograph Harlan had placed on a nearby table. Mr. Wallace in life, smiling with a woman I assumed was his wife, holding up a large fish on a sunny dock, surrounded by laughing children. In those moments, the crushing weight of the house's sorrow would settle over me like a shroud. It was in one of those moments that I made my first mistake. My mind was wandering as I reached for an instrument on the nearby tray, and my elbow brushed against Mr. Wallace's face. The touch was light, barely enough to disturb the careful work we had done. But in that instant, as if time itself had frozen, his eyes snapped open. I froze, the blood turning to ice in my veins. The eyes, once dull and lifeless, were now filled with a terrifying awareness, a look of pure panic and despair that bored straight into my soul. Mr. Wallace's mouth fell open in a silent scream, his hands flailing uselessly at the air. I cried out, stumbling backward, ready to run. But Harlan was there in a flash, his hands clamped firmly over the dead man's eyes, muttering something under his breath, a chant I couldn't understand. The whole thing was over as quickly and bizarrely as it had begun. Mr. Wallace's body went slack again, his eyes drifted shut, and his face settled back into its placid, deathly mask. Harlan straightened up, his face grim. "Rule number 1, he said, his voice low but firm. Get their eyes closed. Keep them closed. You don't want them to see you. Not in here." All I could do was nod, my heart hammering, my mind reeling from the horror of what I just witnessed. It was a lesson I would never forget. The rest of the day passed in a tense, gray blur as Harlan instructed me in the finer points of cosmetic restoration, how to hide the ravages of illness and trauma, how to create an illusion of peaceful repose. But no matter how hard I tried to focus, the image of those terrified, accusing eyes haunted me. It wasn't until the family arrived for the viewing that I began to understand the true depth of the strangeness that permeated Andrew's son's funeral home. They filed in, one by one, dressed in black, their faces etched with grief. But as they gazed upon their carefully prepared loved one in his casket, their expressions began to change. The sadness receded, replaced by something darker, more unsettling. The woman, Mr. Wallace's wife from the photograph, leaned in close, her lips brushing her husband's ear as she whispered, "You look just like you did on our wedding day." There was an eerie fondness in her voice, as if he were merely sleeping. The others gathered around, murmuring in agreement, a strange, feverish light in their eyes. They spoke of Mr. Wallace not as someone who was gone, but as someone who was merely away, someone who would be returning at any moment. My unease grew as they began placing strange little objects into the coffin with him. A tarnished pocket watch, a faded photograph, a lock of hair tied with a silk ribbon. Harlan watched all of this with a grim satisfaction, as if it were some dark ritual he'd witnessed 1,000 times before. It was only after the last of the mourners had left that I noticed the small, leather-bound book, its pages yellowed with age, tucked beneath Mr. Wallace's folded hands. Curiosity got the better of me. I reached out, my fingertips brushing against the cold, waxy skin. Just as I was about to open the cover, Harlan's hand shot out and grabbed my wrist, his grip surprisingly strong. "Rule number 3, he hissed, his eyes blazing. "Respect the final wishes of every client. You don't have to like them, but you must obey them." I snatched my hand back, my heart racing, my mind filled with 1,000 unasked questions. What secrets did that book hold? What dark rites had Harlan's words just hinted at? But I knew better than to ask. I had taken this job, and I would have to see it through no matter the cost, even if it meant turning a blind eye to the strangeness and sorrow that saturated the very air of Andrew's sons. As Harlan often said, with a strange glint of pleasure, the dead have their rules, and we have ours. The days began to blur into a grim procession of bodies and caskets, of hushed sobs and choked eulogies. I learned to move with the rhythm of the funeral home, to understand the cadence of grief and remembrance. But the more I grew accustomed to the proximity of death, the more I became attuned to the wrongness of Andrew's sons. It was in the little things, the flicker of the lights, the persistent cold spots in certain rooms, the whispers that seemed to echo in the empty hallways when no one was there. Harlan, for his part, seemed untroubled by any of it. If anything, he seemed to draw a strange kind of sustenance from the oppressive atmosphere. The grief that hung over the old house was like a thick, heavy shroud. It was late one evening, as I was locking up the prep room, that I saw her for the first time. A flash of white in the shadows, just at the edge of my vision. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat, but there was nothing there but the glint of stainless steel and the low hum of the coolers. I told myself it was a trick of the light, a product of my own exhaustion. But as I made my way up the creaking stairs to my little room, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that some unseen presence was dogging my steps. That night, I dreamed of the dead, not as they were in their caskets, peaceful and still, but as they had been in life. They crowded around me, their faces twisted in anger and accusation, their fingers plucking at my clothes, my skin, my hair. I woke with a jolt, the sheets tangled around my legs, my heart pounding. And that's when I heard it, a faint, whimpering sound like a child crying. It seemed to be coming from downstairs, from the direction of the prep room. I lay there in the darkness, holding my breath, try to convince myself that it was just my imagination, that there was nothing there. But the sound came again, louder this time, more insistent. It was a cry of fear and pain, a sound that cut through the silence like a knife. I remembered Harlan's rules, his low, grave voice warning me, never investigate the sound of crying, no matter how close, no matter how real. Don't look. But there, in the darkness, with the remnants of my nightmare still clinging to me, I couldn't bring myself to obey. I slipped out of bed, my bare feet cold against the wooden floor, and crept to the door. The hallway was dark and silent, save for the groans of the old house settling on its foundations. My heart was in my throat as I tiptoed down the stairs, each creak amplified by the silence. The crying was coming from behind a small, unmarked door I'd never noticed before, set into the wall of the prep room. With a trembling hand, I pushed it open. The hinges let out a low, groaning protest, and there, in the shadows, I saw her. A little girl, no older than 8 or 9, huddled in the corner of the tiny space. Her face was pale and streaked with tears, her eyes wide with terror. She looked up at me, her lips trembling. For a moment, I saw myself in her. The same fear etched on her face, reflected back at me from the hollow depths of her eyes. I took a step forward, my hand outstretched, a wordless sound catching in my throat. But as I moved to comfort her, to offer some small measure of warmth, the world tilted and warped around me. It was as if I was seeing through her eyes, a chaotic jumble of her memories. I saw pain, fear, and a hopeless, helpless despair. I saw the face of a man, twisted in rage and something darker, a hunger. I felt his rough hands on me, tearing at my clothes, pulling my hair. The air was thick with the smell of blood and sweat and cheap whiskey. I heard his ragged breaths, my own muffled screams. I was violently pulled back into myself. I was standing over the little girl, who was curled into a ball, her eyes pleading, her mouth open in a scream that made no sound. I staggered back, my heart pounding, my vision blurring. I had to get out of this house, out of this nightmare. But a hand, cold as the grave, clamped down on my arm, its grip impossibly strong. I turned, a scream catching in my throat, and found myself staring into the hard, unforgiving face of Harlan Andrews. His eyes were cold, and a cruel smile played on his lips. "I warned you, boy," he rasped, his voice low and menacing. "I told you not to look." He dragged me up the stairs with an inhuman strength, threw me into my room, and slammed the door, leaving me huddled on the floor, the images of what I'd seen seared into my brain. I didn't sleep at all that night. I stared at the ceiling, my thoughts a frantic, swirling vortex. I knew I had to leave this place, to escape the madness of this house and the horrors that lurked within its walls. But even as I lay there in the dark, plotting my escape, I could feel the house itself watching me, waiting like a predator stalking its prey. I knew that no matter how far I ran, the memory of Andrew's sons and the ghosts it kept would follow me. Because in this place, the veil between the living and the dead was more than just thin. It had been torn wide open. The next day, Harlan kept me busy from dawn till dusk, as if trying to distract me from the horrors of the previous night. But in the quiet moments between tasks, my mind would invariably drift back to that small, dark space, to those hollow eyes. As night fell, Harlan practically shoved me up the stairs. "Stay in your room," he snarled, his face grim. "Don't come out, no matter what you hear, no matter what you see." I lay in the dark, every muscle tensed, straining to hear the faintest ghostly whisper, the slightest phantom footstep. But the house was shrouded in a thick, pregnant silence, a quiet that seemed to hold an unspoken threat. The only sounds were the frantic beating of my own heart and the ragged rasp of my own terrified breaths. It felt as if the house was breathing with me, as if it were alive and waiting. Time crawled by at an agonizing pace. I watched the hands on my watch creep past 11, then 12. Harlan's warning echoed in my mind, "Don't leave your room." I couldn't help but imagine what horrors lurked in the darkened hallway, just beyond my door. At some point, I must have drifted into a fitful, uneasy sleep, my mind plagued by nightmares of twisted faces and cold, grasping fingers, of mouths stretched wide in silent screams. I woke with a start to the deepest, most absolute darkness I had ever known. A glance at my watch told me it was 3:38 a.m., the witching hour. I lay in bed, my heart hammering, my breathing shallow, trying to convince myself that it was just a dream, a product of my overfatigued mind. But as I lay there, whispering reassurances to myself, I became aware of a presence in the room with me, a sense of being watched, of something waiting in the shadows. And then I heard it, a soft, muffled sob. It was coming from the far corner of the room, from the deepest, darkest part of the shadows. I froze, a wave of pure terror washing over me, every hair on my body standing on end. The crying grew louder, closer. I knew I shouldn't look, that to acknowledge its presence was to invite a horror I couldn't possibly comprehend. But a morbid compulsion drove me, a need to confront the fear that was lurking in the dark. Slowly, inch by agonizing inch, I turned my head. There by the wall was a small, pathetic figure. It was the little girl from the hidden room. She had her hands over her face, her small shoulders shaking with sobs. I opened my mouth, not sure if I was going to scream or speak. But before I could do either, she looked up. The faint moonlight that filtered through the grimy window fell upon her face. Her eyes were two bleeding, empty sockets, bottomless pits that stared into me, so cold they froze the blood in my veins. Her mouth was stretched wide, her jaw unhinged in a grotesque, unnatural grin. From the horrific void of her mouth, a pale, cold hand emerged, streaked with blood and dirt. It shot toward me with supernatural speed, and its icy fingers closed around my throat, slamming me back against the bed. I clawed at my neck, desperate to break its hold, to draw a breath of burning air. But the grip was merciless, inhuman. My vision began to dim. The last thing I saw was the girl standing up, her eyeless face splitting into a rictus of a triumphant scream. I woke on the floor, drenched in a cold sweat, my heart pounding like a caged animal. Faint, gray light was filtering through the curtains, painting the room in the pale colors of dawn. The girl was gone, as if she'd never been there. But I could still feel the phantom touch of that cold grip on my throat, could still see those bottomless, empty eyes boring into my soul. I knew in that moment I couldn't stay here. No force on earth could make me spend another night in this cursed house. I began frantically stuffing my few belongings into my suitcase, my hands shaking so badly I could barely work the latches. I crept downstairs, moving as quietly as I could, praying that Harlan was still asleep, that I could slip out unnoticed. I was reaching for the cold brass doorknob when a voice came from behind me, low and rasping, laced with a cold amusement. Leaving so soon? My heart seized. I turned to see Harlan standing at the bottom of the stairs. He was already dressed in his usual worn black suit, his thin frame almost lost in the fabric. In the dim light, his eyes seemed to glow with a cold fire. I can't stay here, I stammered, the words catching in my throat like thorns. This place, it's evil. Harlan let out a dry, humorless laugh that sounded like rusting metal. Evil? That's such a strong word. I prefer to think of it as purposeful. He took a slow step toward me, his head tilted to one side, his gaze so intense it made my skin crawl. This house, the work we do here, it's all part of a grand design, a machine that was set in motion long before you or I were ever born. He reached out a withered hand and placed it on my shoulder, his fingers digging in like talons. You have a choice, boy. You can walk out that door. Go back to your small, meaningless life. But you'll never be able to fill the void inside you. You'll know that you turned your back on something greater, something more profound. Or, he continued, you can stay. You can embrace your destiny. You can learn the secrets of life and death, the mysteries that have been passed down through my family for generations. It won't be easy. It will test you, body and soul. But in the end, you will become part of something extraordinary. I stood there paralyzed. My mind reeled with the horrors I had seen within these dark, cold walls. The thought of enduring more of this constant, gnawing fear was almost enough to make me break. And yet, as I stood on that precipice of decision, I felt a strange and terrible pull, as if my fate, whether I wanted it or not, was now inextricably linked to this grim, secret place. Before I could answer, a sudden, frantic knocking erupted from the front door. Heavy fists pounded against the wood, the sound echoing through the silent house, threatening to shake it to its foundations. Harlan's eyes widened, and his grip on my shoulder tightened. "Rule number 9, he hissed, his voice urgent and commanding. "Remember rule number 9. I nodded dumbly, my throat too tight to speak. The warning from that spidery script flashed in my mind, "Do not answer." The knocking came again, louder this time, demanding, insistent. It seemed to vibrate through the very structure of the house, rattling the walls and the ceiling, as if trying to tear the decaying place apart. Harlan and I stood like statues, our eyes locked on the door, the sound of our own heartbeats a frantic duet in our chests. Then, as suddenly as it began, the knocking stopped. A heavy silence fell over the room. We both held our breath, our hearts thundering, our minds racing. Finally, Harlan's voice, low and ghostly, cut through the quiet. "It seems you have a little more time to make your choice than I thought, my boy. But make no mistake, one way or another, Andrew's company always collect their due, in this life or the next."